Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Coffee and Tea with AARP Connecticut. This bi-weekly virtual conversation series features AARP staff and volunteers, as well as decision makers from across Connecticut. In our conversation, we discuss a variety of topics affecting Connecticut's older residents. Today, we're joined by AARP Connecticut volunteer Jim O'Brien and Marissa Gillett, Chair of the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. And this morning, we're going to discuss the PURA, the PURA, which is the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, and what they do and what they mean to your everyday lives here in Connecticut. So I'm going to start off first by introducing our trusted volunteer. This is his second time doing coffee and tea with us. But Jim, for those that have never seen the program before, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at AARP?
Good afternoon. My name is Jim O'Brien. I live in Cheshire, Connecticut. I've been a volunteer with AARP for about 12 years, principally in the area of advocacy, and have done a lot of work with AARP on retail electric rate market. So I'm very happy to participate in today's session, and pleased to meet Commissioner Gillett.
That's great, Jim. And now I'd like to welcome our special guest, Chairman Gillett of the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. And Madam Chairman, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got here to Connecticut?
Happy to. Thank you so much for having me on. So I am a lawyer and engineer by trade, which means that I do neither of those things very well. So I got my start at a comparable agency to PURA in Maryland. So I'm actually from the DC metro area. So in Maryland, they have a similar agency to PURA, as does every state. And I worked my way up through the ranks at that agency, culminating in a position advising the chair of the Maryland Commission. So worked there for about a decade before I transitioned to the Energy Storage Association in the DC area, which is a trade association focused on energy storage, as its name would imply. And really kept in touch with some of my regional counterparts. I did a lot of work on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and met some folks up in Connecticut through that project. And when Commissioner Dykes moved over to lead DEEP, and Connecticut was looking for a head of their regulatory agency, the governor reached out and asked if I would be interested in moving my family up to Connecticut to try to replicate some of the grid modernization work that I had done in Maryland. So I was eager to take on the challenge of understanding everything that was going on here, including our very high electricity rates. So I've been here about 2 years and am excited to go to work every day. Mostly.
That's great, and I'd say it's quite refreshing. We've done a lot of work with the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority over the years, and it's great to see a chair that's getting out and actually explaining what you folks do. So having said that, why don't you tell us a little bit about what PURA does, and then after that, I'll turn it over to Jim, and I know Jim will have some thoughts as well. So why don't you talk to us about PURA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority? What's your function? How do you do what you do?
Absolutely. And I'm really appreciative for platforms like yours and the involvement of your members in our proceedings, because it is, I cannot emphasize enough how crucial it is for members of the public to be involved in PURA proceedings. PURA is, I think, one of the most, or one of the least understood agencies in the state. And I try to explain it like this, because I think it's the easiest analogy that I've come across. PURA is like a court. So myself and I have two colleagues that are also commissioners, and the three of us make essentially a 3-panel of judges. And when material comes before us in the form of a docket, it's akin to a proceeding or a trial that you would be familiar with. It's not law and order in the sense that we have criminal prosecutions before us, but it's that kind of material with rules of evidence. We have witnesses, and essentially there are parties on either side or a whole spectrum of sides of an issue. And myself and the my fellow commissioners, and our staff have to try to find some common ground, and when that's not possible, make a judgment on the issues put before us. Where our primary function is to serve the function of what the market would do if the services that we regulate were competitive, and they're not, right? So we regulate the investor-owned utilities in the state that are in the electric, gas, and water spheres. So they don't have competitors, natural competitors, which means that we're stepping in regulating them and trying to make up for that lack of competition. So we, in addition to regulating them, we've been tasked over the years with regulating electric suppliers. Having just said that they don't have that the Eversource and UI don't have natural competitors, I mean they don't have natural competitors in terms of the delivery of the electricity. The General Assembly did decide to allow competitive supply about 2 decades ago, and so we regulate those entities, which keeps us quite busy. And we have a handful of other, roles in the telecommunications space, increasingly limited, because that was another industry deregulated a couple decades back. So we pick up roles here and there from the legislature, but our primary bread and butter is dealing with the activities of the investor-owned utilities.
It seems like you do have a lot on your plate, but Jim, why don't
Yeah, Commissioner, I'm interested to know over the last 2 years while you've been here, what do you think are the most significant case or two that you have been involved in?
Oh, great question. So in the fall of the first year I was here, we're coming up quickly on the 2-year anniversary. We opened up what's known as our Equitable Modern Grid proceeding, and it has 11 tracks, but I'm going to characterize Grid Mod as my first proceeding. And I think that is one of the most crucial things that we can do in this state is figure out how to modernize our grid while ensuring that all segments of the population are able to take advantage of how the grid is modernized, and that we have to find a way to do it where we're not dramatically increasing rates, given that the rates in this state are already arguably unaffordable. So I'd say that entire umbrella is one of the most impactful cases that I'm involved in. And the second case I would identify is the Tropical Storm Isaias investigation, which took 8 months. And I really value that investigation, both because I think it put a stake in the ground in terms of what I'm willing to tolerate, or in this case, not tolerate. And also, I think it was a hallmark for how impactful the participation of non-traditional stakeholders can be. In that case, we had a couple of municipalities come together and formally intervene and participate in our proceeding. And we also had hundreds of individual residents, including many of your members, provide testimony. And I can assure you, I read every last one of them. I have 5-year-old twins, which means I don't sleep naturally. So I read every last one, and I hope it was reflected in the decision that we reached.
So that's great, Commissioner. And so those are some good examples of proceedings that you have authority over, the types of things you have authority over. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you guys don't have? Because I think some people think anything that you plug in or anything that, we would traditionally consider in the old world utility is under your authority. But so what are some of the things that you really don't have the authority to kind of regulate on over the residents here in Connecticut?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's sometimes easier to explain what we don't have authority over. So I'd say one of the most common question that we get into our call center is about cable and about rates that are charged or the terms of offers. Unfortunately, we no longer, and I say, like, I think it's been 2 decades since PURA or its predecessor have been able to regulate cable in that way. We also don't regulate VoIP, so voice over internet. We also do not regulate broadband in a meaningful way. Another common question that we get is, do we regulate the solar installers? So, the state's really pushing for distributed energy resources like solar on your roof. We don't regulate those installers. Those are kind of the most common questions that we get. Having said that, we always encourage folks to reach out to us if you're not sure whether we regulate or not, because we can either put you in contact with our regulatory affairs people at those companies. So even though the cable companies don't have to do what I tell them, they do have to respond to emails. So we can put you in contact, and we can also point you in the direction of another state agency if we think that they have some jurisdictional hooks.
Because
So
sometimes some of those things are regulated by, like, Department of Consumer Protection, or maybe the Office of Consumer Counsel may have some advice as well to help folks on. And I would say, Commissioner, you're spot on there, because I think we get more contact from members about issues that involve some form of high-speed internet or cable, and it's always difficult in explaining that, while they're not, I would say I would categorize television and phone services at best a duopoly. But in the state's infinite wisdom, we gave them a lot of freedom and leeway, and of course at AARP we're always pushing back on that. But we do get a lot of calls about that, and we always do explain. But I will say, at the risk of getting inundated from a lot of our members, I'm always happy when we do get calls, and I do as well sometimes reach out to my contacts at the different companies, and they usually try to work with you to come up with some resolution if you're having an issue. One of the things generally that you can't resolve is, the rates are what the rates are that they charge, and it's whatever the market will bear. So that's interesting. Jim, do you have anything else? Because I know our volunteers love these issues, and I know Jim is chock full of.
I wanted to step back a minute and just ask a little bit more about this equitable modern grid framework. And I've read a little bit about it, and really I'm not sure what it all means. So, Commissioner, could you tell us what you think PURA's vision for this modernization looks like?
I love this question. I could talk about equitable modern grid all day. So in October 2019, we put out this framework document, and it envisioned 11 separate tracks. And the idea, the overarching idea here is that our grid as it exists today is too centralized, and I want it decentralized. And what I mean by that is I think that individual consumers should be in the future more empowered to have direct control over their usage, whether that means that you individually want solar and storage and can control your reliance on the grid and thus your costs that way, or whether you want to participate in a community solar project or a community project. I think ultimately there's something here for everyone. If the grid is going to face increased frequency of climate change events, and we're going to face reliability or resilience concerns as a whole state or as a region, we need to make sure that individual communities or individuals themselves have more control over their usage, especially as we push folks to electrify everything, whether it's your car or your heating source or other things. So the equitable modern grid is meant to break down barriers, primarily financial ones, so that folks can participate in that vision. And that's, through incentives or performance incentives. Part of this is an affordability track designed at designing or targeted to design a low income discount rate, which is almost a misnomer because it can be a fixed income discount rate too. So it's envisioning not just changing the way that electricity is delivered and consumed, but also the business model and the rate structure. So it's like turning the whole thing on its head. We're 2 years in, and I think we've made some demonstrable progress, and the whole thing is designed to reach a conclusion before my term expires, in case I'm not reappointed, because I don't want someone to drop the ball there.
Right.
Yeah, and that's important. And as I say, you said in your intro that you kind of had that experience dealing with this in Maryland, and it's kind of interesting because Maryland has a lot of the same issues that we do have in Connecticut, whether it's dealing with electric suppliers, dealing with grid modernization, dealing with affordable rates. So it's a nice fit. So kind of along those lines, why don't you tell? Now, my understanding is you have a new education and outreach and enforcement office. So, what is that, and what does that mean for the average resident here in Connecticut?
Absolutely. So it's our Office of Education, Outreach, and Enforcement, and the creation of that office, it's now a year old. And so this is the corollary to my Equitable Modern Grid proceeding. I'm also focused on really modernizing how PURA interacts with members of the public and how we do business. And I think that's in line, with the governor's vision for modernizing state government as a whole. And what this office is specifically targeted to do is they're walled off from the rest of PURA, figuratively. So as I mentioned at the top of the hour, since we are, if you think about us like a court, I'm bound by legal rules that prevent me from discussing the merits of a case outside of my hearing room. This group of my staff, they've been exposed to the same training. They have the same expertise as the rest of my staff, but they are walled off and not subject to those ex parte rules, which means that they can do specific outreach to non-traditional stakeholders to help those stakeholders engage in our proceedings. And they can go out into the community, and whether that's a homeowners association meeting, a town hall, and give presentations about things like how to engage in PURA. So that's the education and outreach component of that office. The enforcement piece goes with that too. They are heavily focused on enforcing rules that we have laid out for electric suppliers. They're also looking at enforcement of vegetation management standards, or we can delegate to them leadership of a working group issue. So they're really crucial to my mind to make PURA less of a black box and hopefully more accessible to the average ratepayer, because it should not be the case that only Eversource and UI get to know how to engage with us, because it's not producing, I don't think it has historically produced an equitable result.
Commissioner, how should people get involved? Connecticut consumers become more involved?
Great question. So there's a whole spectrum of ways to get involved, from like passive to active. On the passive end of the spectrum, you can sign up for email alerts on a specific topic that you're interested in. Now, this still requires navigating our case management system, which I fondly refer to as something that's older than I am. So we recognize that shortcoming and are working on it. But assuming you can navigate to the case that you're interested in, you can sign up for email alerts. And as I move more to the active end of that spectrum, you can submit written comments by email or through our web portal at any time on any docket. You can also appear live and provide those same comments during a public hearing. We right now are holding all of our proceedings by Zoom. Or on the most active end of the spectrum, you can collate your resources as an organization or as a municipality and formally intervene in a proceeding. And I know AARP has done that in the past. And the benefits of that are you can put on a witness, you can cross-examine other witnesses. So there's really a whole range. And I recognize that it's not practical to hire representation and intervene in every docket that we have. But we're trying to emphasize to folks that it matters when you put in writing your thoughts on something, because we can aggregate all of that testimony and use it as evidence in a proceeding. So a lot of different options, and we're looking to make those options more accessible, open to feedback on that as well.
Yeah, and Madam Chairman, it's interesting because, often from the characters that represent utilities, they often say, oh, you're just going to scream the rates are too high. And actually, I think it's, it's really great because I think there is a lot more depth to, the comments that real people provide to your agency about various things that are going on. I mean, people are first and foremost concerned about rates, but people are also reasonable, and they want to be heard, and they want to know that when they're heard, it's taken into consideration when you're balancing equities, between the utilities and the public's need to have reliable services and affordable services, right? I mean, that's part of your job, is this balancing of equities between all these parties, like judges that you act, and so that's great. So why don't you tell us anything else that we haven't really touched on that you think it's important for the public to hear from you folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So speaking of, rates, one thing that I would encourage folks to do is we've put together tutorials through that education office that I was talking about a few minutes ago. So we've recorded some narrated PowerPoints that are available on our YouTube page that really break down the components of your Eversource or UI electric bill, and really try to explain to folks what the drivers of each of those line items is. And I'd encourage folks to pay some attention to that if you have a moment, because I think one of the more misunderstood things about what PURA does is what percentage of that electric monthly bill we have direct control over. And the reason that's important, I think, is some of the drivers on your monthly bill flow through from state or federal policy. So advocating before PURA about those line items isn't always going to be effective, as we're not able to control those rates. So we're trying to make that more transparent about what the drivers of your bill are, so you can understand not only who to advocate for before, but how to advocate. So if you haven't had a chance to review those clips, I would offer that to you.
Well, no, that's very helpful, Madam Chairman. And folks like Jim and our volunteers, we are before probably as much, if not more, the Energy and Technology Committee of the Legislature about those things that we believe are drivers of increases in people's overall bill versus rates, right? I mean, you regulate rates, you're not in charge of the entire bill. And then there are things that public officials, be it state or federal, require utilities to charge for different things, and you have no say in that. So that's an important thing for people to understand. And because, as I say, sometimes people just are angry, but most people, when they understand it, and we'll get there. Now, I wasn't going to ask this, but we've gone down this path. So is there another proceeding about bill design?
There is. So as folks might remember, back to the July timeframe of 2020, right before the tropical storm hit, there was so a number of these line items on your bill, and they're called out in this tutorial, are called reconciling adjustment mechanisms. And they are adjusted twice a year through a proceeding before PURA. And they largely are pass-throughs from the utility to the developer and from the customer, and they're largely driven by state policy. Those reconciling adjustments hit Eversource customer bills in late July, early August in 2020, and caused a massive unexpected increase in customer bills. As a result,
at the height of the pandemic as well.
Right at the height of the pandemic and right before the tropical storm. And we undertook a couple-month investigation, got to the bottom of what happened there, and then more importantly, to my mind, try to figure out how to prevent that moving forward. And that involved a redesign of our internal process about how we review those, and also found that the customer bills have really become a misnomer. Folks are focused on the supply versus the delivery, and don't are understandably frustrated because they don't understand how come it costs 2 or 3 times more to deliver electricity than to supply it. And that's because the delivery component of your bill is encompassing many more things than just the true delivery. And so we ordered a redesign of customer bills. Our Office of Education Outreach and Enforcement is leading that stakeholder group. Their report and recommendation to us is due by the end of September of 2021. And it will take PURA, a couple of months after that to finalize those recommendations. But again, that's not going to deliver relief in the terms of reduced rates, but it will hopefully get to enhanced transparency so you understand what the different drivers of your bill are and who to contact about that.
Well, and that, Commissioner, that's a very significant point, because I have always looked at my bill and assumed that those high delivery costs simply meant maintaining the wires and the poles and cutting down trees. And I'll be very interested to read more about it and see what else is involved. I think that's a great effort. Thank you.
And Jim is one of our peer educators and does presentations. We focus mainly on, whether or not you should choose a supplier or not, but in that presentation, there is a significant component of it that talks about how to understand, your bill. And I think Jim could kind of attest to the fact that is one of the, as we're going over some of these things and people bring their bills and have them right there in front of them, can't even find stuff that, was meant for them to find, and it is somewhat understandable. So we're looking forward to that. Jim, you have any other questions for the chairman? I know we're coming up close to our time here.
This may not be a quick answer, but when we do education sessions for people, many are interested in purchasing their electricity through non-carbon means, wind or solar. And we're not really sure that if I'm buying electricity and I think it's coming from solar power, that it's really coming from solar power. Part of me thinks that's not true. Could you share any thoughts about that?
Sure. I'd say your instincts are correct. So there is a concept called a renewable energy credit, which is essentially the paper it's a piece of paper that's trying to capture the environmental attributes of 1 megawatt hour of electricity. So for reference, like an average consumer uses between 700 and 1,000 kilowatt hours per month, and a megawatt hour is 1,000 kilowatt hours. So 1 rec equals 1 megawatt hour. The rec is not actually guaranteeing that those electrons from the solar, and let's just stick with solar, is not guaranteeing that those electrons are being delivered to you. The concept is that by purchasing that rec, you are providing financial support to that renewable developer so that they can proliferate their renewable resources. If you were truly interested in purchasing the renewable electrons, the closer thing to get to that is a power purchase agreement, which are usually executed between commercial entities and a renewable supplier. Or you can enroll in our shared clean energy facility program, which is a community solar concept, or put solar on your roof. But to get to your point about, am I really buying this or not? We have a state offering a voluntary renewable energy supply program that PURA has recently redesigned to make sure that the suppliers are, in our opinion, accurately marketing this to customers as a financial commodity rather than that you're actually purchasing that green power, to just, again, make what you're buying more transparent. And that's, of course, up to the individual consumer, whether they want to pay more for their electricity to support those efforts. I would share with folks that, the governor has made a commitment through an executive order that we are pursuing 100% carbon-free electric grid by 2040. And the state has a lot of aggressive policies in place where we're under commitment for renewable generation already. So those costs are baked into your electricity bill as it stands today. So I think folks should have some comfort that, as we get closer to meeting those goals as a state, that you're supporting those resources. And coincidentally, it's the 10th track of my Equitable Modern Grid proceeding to focus on making that more transparent about how those power purchase agreements the state has executed, be it Millstone, be it offshore wind, be it large solar, to make it more transparent what percentage of our supply is already supporting a renewable resource.
Madam Chairman, I think that transparency will really help with a lot of these things because, just people don't understand. And, listen, I'm the first one to criticize the utilities themselves when I think they're not doing the right thing or not behaving as a good corporate citizen. The same with the unregulated folks. But on the other hand, we have to also not have consumers blaming them for things, they have no control over, whether it's dealing with these wrecks or it's dealing with what is baked into the cake in terms of state requirements for anything, for renewable programs, whatever the case may be. We have to hold them to the standards, right, that they're obligated to under, the monopoly that they have. But we also have to be fair and make sure that people do get the information we need. And that's why, you're coming on and having this conversation with our folks is so critical. And we really do appreciate it. So I do want to thank Jim O'Brien, one of our great volunteers who does a lot of work on utilities. And certainly I want to thank you, Commissioner Gillett, for being with us. And, any last parting words?
Just to thank you for the platform, and I would be more than happy to come on in the future and address any follow-up questions.
We'd love to have you again. So thank you, folks, for joining us for another edition of Coffee and Tea with AARP.